She almost didn't bring her daughter. Standing at the doorway that evening, she had looked down at the small girl beside her, already dressed, already waiting. As if she understood that sometimes life didn't give second chances to working mothers. The babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and there was no time to rearrange anything. Important people were expecting her. Investors, board members, department heads, the kind of people who believed time was money and emotions were inefficiencies. Her daughter didn't ask if she could come, she just held her hand quietly. And that silence made the decision for her. By the time they arrived at the restaurant, the meeting had already begun. Laughter drifted across the table, calculated, rehearsed laughter that lived in corporate spaces, where sincerity was often replaced by strategy. Conversations paused for a moment when she stepped in, noticing the child beside her, but resumed quickly enough for politeness to remain intact. No one welcomed the girl, but no one objected either. That was the thing about professional environments. Judgment rarely arrived loudly, it came disguised as tolerance. Her daughter slid into the seat next to her, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't reach for the menu, didn't look around, didn't interrupt. She simply existed softly, carefully, as though trying not to disturb the balance of a world she knew she didn't belong to. The CEO could feel it immediately, the shift in tone. The subtle exchange of glances between senior partners seated across from her. The polite smiles that lingered a second too long before fading into something else. Something quieter, something colder. Workplace drama didn't always announce itself through arguments or raised voices. Sometimes it came wrapped in silence and strategic patience. She had built this company from nothing. Stayed late when no one else would. Sacrificed weekends, friendships, even pieces of her own health to make sure her employees had stability. And yet tonight, sitting at that long table beneath soft golden lights, she felt like an outsider in the very empire she had created. Her daughter shifted slightly beside her. Across the table sat Daniel, the newest member of the finance department. A single dad who kept to himself, rarely engaging in office gossip, rarely staying longer than necessary after meetings ended. Some of the team assumed he lacked confidence. Others believed he simply didn't care enough to socialize. In truth, he was just tired. Raising a child alone while trying to hold onto a demanding corporate job didn't leave much room for meaningless conversation. Every day was a quiet negotiation between survival and responsibility. He noticed the girl immediately, the way her feet didn't quite reach the floor, the way her eyes remained fixed on the tablecloth. The way she leaned ever so slightly toward her mother, as though proximity could protect her from the unfamiliar atmosphere. He recognized that kind of silence. His own son had worn it once. The meeting continued, discussions revolving around company growth, leadership expansion, and future restructuring plans that sounded impressive but carried undertones of something else entirely. Something unspoken. The CEO listened carefully. Words like transition and new direction slipped casually into conversation, wrapped in optimism but edged with intention. She knew corporate language well enough to understand what was being prepared. Corporate betrayal rarely happened overnight. It built itself slowly, through private meetings, closed-door discussions, and polite invitations to dinners that felt more like negotiations than celebrations. Her daughter's hand tightened around the edge of her sleeve when someone at the far end of the table laughed too loudly. The sound seemed harmless to everyone else. But not to a child who was already unsure if she was welcome. "You must have had trouble finding a sitter," one of the board members said finally, offering a tight smile. It sounded like concern. But it was. Her daughter lowered her gaze further, cheeks flushing slightly as though she had personally disrupted something important simply by being there. The CEO opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a soft voice from across the table interrupted. "My son used to do that too." Daniel hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't leaned forward or drawn attention to himself in any dramatic way, but his words cut gently through the conversation, causing it to pause. Several heads turned toward him in mild confusion. "He used to sit exactly like that," Daniel continued calmly, nodding toward the girl, hands in his lap, shoulders tucked in like he was trying to take up less space. No one responded immediately. Because this wasn't the kind of discussion that belonged in corporate meetings, but Daniel didn't stop. He thought if he stayed quiet enough, no one would notice he didn't belong, he added. Something in the CEO's chest tightened unexpectedly. The board member who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm sure she's fine," he said lightly, attempting to steer the conversation back toward business. Daniel's expression didn't change. He stopped speaking for almost a year after his mother passed away, he said. Teachers thought he was being difficult, relatives thought he was rude. But really, he just didn't want to be a problem anyone had to solve. The table fell silent, not because they cared, but because they didn't know how to respond without revealing too much of themselves. Daniel finally looked toward the CEO. I learned something from him, he said quietly. The quietest person in the room is usually the one carrying the most weight. Her daughter's fingers loosened slightly against her sleeve. It was a small change, barely noticeable. But for the first time that evening, she wasn't trying quite as hard to disappear. The silence that followed didn't fade quickly. It lingered in the air, heavier now, pressing gently against everyone seated at the table. Conversations that had once flowed easily suddenly felt forced, like rehearsed lines spoken by people who had forgotten their purpose midway through the performance. The CEO understood why. Because kindness had a strange way of interrupting ambition, and Daniel had just done exactly that. The meeting resumed, but something had shifted. Words like future planning and organizational evolution didn't sound as harmless anymore. They sounded like warnings. Like careful preparations for a decision that had already been made behind closed doors. She noticed how one of the senior partners avoided looking directly at her now. Another checked his phone more frequently than before. A third kept tapping his fingers against the table in quiet impatience. They were waiting. Waiting for the right moment to introduce the proposal that would slowly push her out of the position she had earned through years of sacrifice. Corporate betrayal didn't always come with hostility. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a vote, a suggestion, a strategic recommendation presented as concern for the company's long-term stability. Her daughter shifted beside her again. But this time she wasn't shrinking, she was listening. Daniel noticed that too. He noticed how the girl's eyes moved carefully from one speaker to another. How she studied the expressions of people who smiled without warmth. How she instinctively sensed tension in voices that pretended to remain calm. Children understood more than adults liked to admit. Especially when it came to unfairness. One of the board members finally cleared his throat. As part of our expansion plans, he began smoothly, we believe it may be time to consider a leadership restructuring that better aligns with the company's evolving direction. There it was. Wrapped in professionalism, delivered with confidence, designed to sound like progress instead of replacement. The CEO felt her daughter's hand move slightly against her arm, not gripping this time but resting there. Present, steady, she didn't speak immediately. Because sometimes strength meant listening long enough to understand exactly who was standing with you and who was standing against you. Daniel set his glass down quietly. If I may, he said. No one had invited him into the conversation, but he continued anyway. I know I'm new here, he added, voice calm but firm. But before any decisions are made tonight, I think it's important to acknowledge something. A few of the partners exchanged irritated glances. This wasn't his place. He wasn't senior enough. Didn't have enough authority, didn't understand how these decisions worked, but Daniel understood something else. I reviewed the company's internal reports last week, he said. Staff retention rates are the highest they've been in 5 years. Employee satisfaction has improved. Revenue growth has remained stable despite market fluctuations. He paused briefly. All of that happened under her leadership. The words weren't emotional, they were factual, and facts were harder to dismiss. Another partner leaned forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. This isn't about performance, he insisted. It's about preparing for future opportunities. Daniel nodded slightly. Then maybe future opportunities should be built on loyalty instead of convenience, he replied. The statement settled over the table like truth that no one wanted to accept. Because replacing someone who had given everything to the company wasn't innovation, it was ingratitude. Her daughter looked up then, not at the board members but at Daniel. And for the first time that evening, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Relief, not because the situation had changed, but because someone had chosen to be kind when it would have been easier to stay silent. Kindness in corporate environments didn't come through grand gestures. It came through small risks. Through choosing honesty over safety. Through speaking up when someone else's dignity was quietly being negotiated. The CEO finally found her voice, but she didn't raise it. She didn't defend herself or argue against the proposal that had been carefully prepared to remove her. Instead, she placed her hand gently over her daughter's and smiled. Because sometimes the greatest victory wasn't keeping your position. It was showing your child that integrity mattered more than power. The vote that night didn't go the way the board had expected. Not because policies had changed, but because one person had reminded them what leadership actually looked like. It wasn't control, it wasn't authority. It was kindness shown when it was least convenient. And long after the meeting ended, what people remembered most wasn't the proposal or the discussion about restructuring. It was the quiet voice of a single father who refused to let someone else's worth be decided in silence. Sometimes the unexpected hero wasn't the one in charge. Sometimes it was the one who simply cared enough to speak.